Today's Senators Nation podcast was brought to you by Manscaped. Head to manscaped.com and use the promo code capital C, capital L, Nation, and to receive 20% off plus free delivery on all their products. Welcome to the latest podcast of Senators Nation. This is Pat LaRusso. I'll soon be joined by my co-host Lucas Ugenti, where we're going to look back at some of the worst trades in Toronto Maple Leafs history and their impact on the franchise. Welcome to the latest podcast of Senators Nation. This is Pat LaRusso, and I have my co-host Lucas Ugenti. Welcome, Lucas.
Hello, how's everyone doing?
It's been a crazy week. You know, it's funny, with so little to talk about, I thought, you know what, let's have some fun with our second last podcast of 2020. And let's kind of discuss some of the least memorable Toronto Maple Leafs trades over the years. I know when you and I spoke about this offline, you know, you had a good little chuckle. And, you know, you had your feelings and some of your, trades that stood out to you. But just overall, without getting it too into depth before we go into the three that we've selected, sort of what were your thoughts as you were looking over, all the different Leafs trades over the years?
My thoughts, I could go on for days about my thoughts, but at the end of the day, it's tough to analyze a trade. Even looking back on it and trying to say, hey, this actually was the worst trade in history, because you get years of what do you even want to call this, history, I guess. The events that take place, like, everything's situational, and I mean, especially in the NHL, when there's that trade deadline that comes so late in the season, where you have a knee-jerk reaction where it's like, hey, listen, we have an opportunity to make the playoffs, we have an opportunity to make a cup run, we have the opportunity to finish last. I mean, all these situations have actually happened in my time as being a Leaf fan. I can only imagine longer. And after reading some of these trades that happened, and you try and break it down situationally, and why did the current GM of the time who made the trade make the trade, and you look at it, and truthfully, wow, some of these deals, even when you look at it from their perspective, the GM's perspective, and you're like, okay, this is why they made this deal, some of them just don't make sense. And we'll get into it more as the podcast goes on, but yeah, some of these deals were eye openers. And you got to understand too, I'm 23 years old, so a lot of these bad deals came before my time, so I didn't even know some of these deals existed. I'm sure you hear the story, you hear my dad talk about how bad some of these deals were, and just being a Leaf fan for so long, you hear about them, but until you actually read them and read the details that follow, man, it's an eye opener.
It is, and that kind of leads us to, not necessarily number one, because the three that we selected, depending on the era, depending on, your thoughts and opinion of each trade, one through three, might change up a little. But I definitely wanted to lead off on the Bernie Perron, Larry Goodenow for Bob Neely and Doug Favell. This was a trade that the Leafs made with the Philadelphia Flyers. At the time, Harold Ballard was the owner, and I'm sure there was some disruption as well at the time. Based on news articles I was able to find, he wasn't happy with the Leafs, so the Leafs were kind of pushed into this trade. But where I know in certain situations, it does call for a rash trade, but sometimes you do need to take a step back, remove the emotion, and get the best deal possible. But this trade just looks so bad. In the first 2 years of Bernie Perron's time in the Flyers, he wins 2 Stanley Cups, 2 Vezinas, and 2 Conn Smythes. And the 2 players the Leafs got, I don't even know. Like, did they even? Like, I don't
understand, Pat. It's sorry to cut you off, because this is what I don't understand, and maybe you can actually answer this question. Maybe I'll pose it as a question. I understand. Well, I come to believe, at least, because again, I can't stress this enough, I wasn't around at the time, so I don't know what was going on. But from my speculation here and from what I've read, Bernie Parent was obviously not happy being a Maple Leaf. That's fine. You're entitled to that opinion, and you're more than allowed to just not like your situation. But what I don't understand is why they thought that trading a goalie for an underachieving first round defenseman and then a backup goalie was the play.
Yeah,
Like barring everything else, you take the situation aside, and it's like, hey, this guy doesn't want to be here. Maybe Philly was the only team offering them a deal at the time. I don't know, and those are things that we probably will never know. But
yeah,
in what way is acquiring an underachieving defenseman? And again, can't stress this enough. This is just from what I'm reading and from what
yes.
research I've done. An underachieving defenseman posting average numbers and a backup goalie for a starting goaltender.
It when you look back, like, and I know I kind of caught, because I'm only 41, so I would have caught the tail end of the Ballard era. Fortunately enough for myself. But it kind of, as soon as he took over the team began its downturn. Almost immediately. He had many character flaws. There were so many stories about, how he treated his employees. The disruption he caused in management, which then trickled down to the team. So, when a lot of us speak of the Maple Leafs drought in the Stanley Cup, not winning one in over 50 years, it's trades like these that begin to give it context. You begin to understand why.
Seriously.
And, it actually kind of, for someone that is maybe of an older generation that might be listening to this, I think it really puts into context the ownership and management group we have today. No GM is going to make 100% perfect trade. Dubas isn't perfect. We've had our debates about what Kyle Dubas has done and what he hasn't done. But there hasn't been too many trades with maybe the Nazem Kadri trade where you could say the Leafs lost.
Wow.
Where
do you want to get into that again?
Yeah, I think the Kadri trade was kind of suspect. I think looking back, it just, all in all, it didn't work out for abundance amount of reasons. It's not just about Tyson Barrie's time here and what it was like to kind of start the season off with Mike Babcock. But when you look at some of these Bernie Parent trades, and I'm hearing people complain about the current management group, and it's like, really? Like, we just traded away a Hall of Fame. Like, when I was looking at these and going over, some of the worst trades in Maple Leafs history, it became a cautionary tale.
Right.
Like, a lot of alarms went off. I don't know if you felt the same way when you look at this current Leafs team. Yes, it's it probably still has some holes it needs to fill, but a lot of these trades, a lot of where you can go wrong is when you feel you're forced into a trade. Which, when we go into the next one as well, our next trade that you and I kind of pointed out and kind of had a good little laugh at, it really speaks to the need to just take a step back, remove the emotion, take your time and make sure that whatever it is, whatever your next step is, that it's a smart move. So that kind of
makes me wonder. Because
yes,
you saying that right there makes me wonder why, and this is us speaking specifically on the Bernie Parent trade. It makes me wonder why they felt the need, and this is obviously pressure coming from Bernie, but why they felt the need to rush a deal like that. Like, and it's kind of the point I'm trying to make. Like, it makes no sense, and I understand that management and thought process and how you construct a team was so different back then, so different. Yeah. We're talking 50 years ago. Like, I understand that, but in context, it really is just common sense and logical thinking. Like, if you're looking at it from even an outsider, you're going, all right, they just traded a good goalie for an underachieving defenseman. It's not like they were, and I understand there's a ceiling, there's a floor that's kind of always been around. I assume that the management thought the same thing back then when they received Bob Neely. They were like, listen, this guy was highly touted. He was a first round player. Maybe he's not panning out right now, but it is what it is. So hopefully that change of scenery might spark things. But when has that really ever panned out? I mean, again, I've only been watching hockey for 23 years, but I can tell you that very, very, very seldom does a trade that you make based off ceiling actually really pan out. So it really makes you wonder. It makes you wonder what was going on in that time.
Yeah, it was definitely, it kind of speaks to where the organization began to spiral down. And that actually, once again, that takes us to number two on our list. You know, this trade, and I before we even go into it, I'll explain which one it was. So as number two, Lucas, after you and I kind of discussed it, you and I pointed out the Russ Courtnall and John Cordick trade.
Yeah.
But I found a really interesting clip on an article that I believe the gentleman's name was Cam Lewis, from Leafs Nation, the LeafsNation.com wrote, back in June of 2020. And this is eerily similar to our current Toronto Maple Leafs. So this is what he wrote. By the time this trade was made, or at the time of this trade was made, Toronto's roster had become too one-dimensional. They had a bunch of young forwards who could score, like Vincent Damphousse, Eddie Olczyk, Gary Leeman, and Daniel Marois, but they didn't have any toughness on their roster. In the summer of 1988, the Leafs parted ways with bruiser Dave Semenko and Al Secord, leaving them soft as butter lineup. In today's NHL, that's not a problem, but this was 1980s, Wild Wild West. And teams without goons were getting their asses kicked. The Leafs were in a tough-as-nails Norris division, which featured enforcers like Bob Probert, Dave Manson, and Basil McRae. In order to address this need, General Manager Gord Stellick went out and acquired one of the toughest guys around, Montreal's John Cordick. Wow. Like, here we are. It's almost as if you could transplant those names to Mitch Marner, William Nylander, Austin Matthews, John Tavares, and Morgan Riley. And we were talking about this exact same thing last summer.
Yeah.
And my biggest cautionary tale is I can acknowledge there was a need for toughness on this roster, but I'm not trading a top six forward to acquire it. Yeah. And I always went back. My biggest argument with those that said, "Hey, this team is soft," and I was like, and my argument was, "You're correct." But once again, and it spoke to what you said earlier, is why are we trading players when we don't know what their ceilings are? Like, be it Mitch Marner, be it William Nylander, for a guy that is one-dimensional. And in today's NHL, there's no goons. Yeah, you might need someone to lay the odd body check, but we're what, 60 to 70% less fighting in today's game than there was even 5-10 years ago. Like, I think was the last stat that I read. Like, if we don't learn from our past, we're just going to repeat the same failures of our future. And that was one of the initial points that popped out at me as I'm reading this article about this horrendous trade where, Russ Courtnall went on to have a pretty successful NHL career. Cordick only played 104 games. Now, to all our listeners, this isn't an indictment on Cordick. He was what he was. He did what he had to do in Toronto. Regrettably, he had some, addiction issues. And he died, unfortunately, outside of hockey, after his career had been finished. But, this is the type of trade where all the telltale signs says this was going to go bad. Like, it was going to go bad and go bad really quickly. And they still made the trade anyways.
This was under Ballard again, I assume, right?
Yeah, Ballard again.
The timeline. Again, so before my time. This was obviously like 15 years before my time, 14 years before my time. And the crazy thing I find the most crazy about this specific deal is solely the fact that they traded talent for toughness.
Yeah.
And again, clearly Harold Ballard, I don't know, lacked common sense. I don't know. And again, I wasn't around. I don't know the situation. Don't know what was going on at the time. I'm purely off facts here, but you're trading talent for toughness in a league, and I understand how tough that was. You mentioned some pretty big names. You mentioned Bob Probert. Who else did you mention? Dave Mann. Like you mentioned some tough guys. Fine. Yeah. You don't win by fighting. You don't win by having 10 penalty minutes because you went out there and fought twice. You don't win by having the greatest fourth line. You win by scoring goals.
Yeah.
Again, I understand. 88, 87, whenever this deal happened, I understand that you had to get tough in order to, I don't want to say necessarily succeed, but survive, let's say. You have to get tough to survive in a league that was purely, grit, physicality, and they were going to drive you into the ice to score goals. And I understand all that, but still, logically speaking, common sense, you just traded talent, a goal scorer, for toughness, thinking that was gonna send you to the finals. That was gonna give you the edge. People were gonna be looking at Toronto and saying, whoa, they just got a lot tougher now. This became a whole lot more, tough to go into I assume it was Maple Leaf Gardens at the time. Maple Leaf Gardens, to go in there and come out with a win. Like, it just doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to me now. I can't process it, almost, because I come from a generation, an era where if you're trading talent for anything other than more talent, you're almost insane. And you mentioned, the Nylanders, the Marners, whatever, howbeit. And you've heard, since Nylander was a youngster 4 years ago, 2016 when he was drafted, 2015 when he was drafted. No, later. Sorry, earlier, right? It was earlier than 2015. Yeah.
No. Yeah.
Sorry, go. Yeah. My point was, his name has been mentioned in trying to trade talent for grit. Let's get rid of Nylander's massive contract and bring in a couple tough guys, a couple guys who can. Listen, not every tough guy in the NHL is Tom Wilson, who can tuck 25 goals. Ryan Reeves isn't tucking 25 goals. Ryan Reeves isn't scoring 20 goals. Kyle Clifford wasn't scoring 20 goals. So at the end of the day, yeah, you can trade skill for a little bit of toughness if that toughness gets you 25 goals a year. If you're getting Wayne Simmons in his prime, a guy who's going to mix it up but score 20, 25 goals. That wasn't what happened there, and that isn't what a lot of Leaf fans wanted to happen now. And like you said, it is kind of telling. It's like, listen, Toronto, we've had this past. We've seen what happened. Like, literally, the proof is in the pudding. We saw what happens when you trade talent for toughness, albeit times were different kind of toughness, different kind of players. But it was evident. Look what happened. And this was however long. This was over 40 years ago. And it still technically haunts Toronto to this day.
Yeah, it's still it's a cultural thing. And really, like, looking back on it, did the Leafs really need to trade Russ Courtnall? Like, do the Leafs really need to trade William Nylander to acquire that toughness? Like, you can find assets in the bottom six. Like, you had to assume that the Leafs had a bottom six.
Right. You don't stumble upon assets in the bottom, you don't stumble upon talent in the top six, right? You don't just mistakenly grab. And listen, it happens. There's obviously cases. There's obviously 5th or 6th or 7th round guys who pan out to be great. It happens. Engvall was a prime example of that. I'm not saying he was a great talent, but usually guys in the later rounds don't make it out, and he made it out.
Yeah.
But you can fill your bottom six pretty easily if you're looking for strictly toughness. Yeah.
And even in the 80s, with that being the need, you're trying to tell me you couldn't find anyone else to trade for John Kordic?
Right.
Like,
there was nobody in free agents?
There was no free agents. There was, you couldn't trade a 2nd or 3rd round pick. We all know the Leafs weren't drafting well. So, what good is a pick at the time? Like, flip it to get the asset that you need. But, going out of your way to lose a trade, you never win in the end.
How much would and this obviously, ties to the current times, but how much would a 4th liner, and I put this in air quotations, really have costed if you weren't going for the best 4th liner? If you were going for just an average, it couldn't have been more than a 4th or 5th round.
No, not back then. Even still back then.
Yeah, right? Like, it blows my mind. It genuinely blows my mind.
But even too, like, when you mention guys like Bob Probert and Wendell Clark and Ty Domi and all those other goons that kind of came in, the late 80s, early 90s, they could score. Like, Bob Probert had hands. He was effective. He wasn't one dimensional. He's probably scored some pretty big goals for Detroit over the years. And then to kind of look at what we got in that Russ Courtnall deal only makes it worse, because you could go out and get a goon, but get a goon that could produce. And there were quite a few of them at the time.
Right.
That weren't just one dimension.
And this isn't a knock on Kordic by any means.
No.
This isn't us saying Kordic was bad for Toronto, because really he just happened to be involved in the deal that ended up being a terrible deal for the Maple Leafs.
Yes. Yeah, it's not a knock on Kordic. He gave his heart and soul. He had those, how many fights in those 104 games before being traded to Washington. And he was what he was. But from a trade perspective, from a strictly hockey perspective, we look back at this organization and say, why did they not win? This is the reason why you don't win.
Yeah, it was incredibly poor asset management. Incredibly poor.
And Lucas, your last point takes us to our final trade. And this is one that I know you and I are going to have a little bit of a longer chat because, it's a little bit more contemporary for us both. But it is the Tuukka Rask for Andrew Raycroft trade.
Ugh.
Under management of John Ferguson Jr. So you know what, Lucas, I'll let you lead this one because I know it's a little bit more contemporary. It's a little bit one that we both have a little bit more context around. But I'd love to get your thoughts on it.
But here's the thing, and this is more a personal thing rather than it fact based. I understand why the trade happened. Okay, I get it. Justin Pogge was highly touted. Let's not pretend like Justin Pogge wasn't supposed to be the next big thing. He was. He was the poster boy, really. Every Team Canada, World Juniors, unbelievable. Everyone thought this was going to be the guy, and I don't blame them. What I don't understand is you've seen both these guys in practice. The scouts have been watching. The coaches have been watching. Management's been watching. At what point did they look at both of these youngsters and say, hey, we have two good young goalies in a league where you need good goaltending?
Yes.
Why was the first reaction to trade one of the young goalies for another good goalie? Like, again, logically, it still doesn't really make sense.
No.
I get that Raycroft won the Calder in 2003, 2004. I understand that. Great goalie. I think he was one of the best players in the OHL at the time too. I think he won that award as well, if I'm not mistaken. Raycroft dominated early on, and I completely understand that. You're sitting there, you're John Ferguson, and you're like, wow, Boston's willing to give us this goalie. We're gonna have to give up one of our technically could have been our third goalie if they chose right and gave up Pogge. It could have been their third goalie at the time, and I understand that. But you had the talent. Yes. So let's just say they believed in Pogge so much, and they believed in Rask so much. Why would you not just go with the two? Like, what was the actual reason? Did they assume that Pogge and Rask were that far away from actually being a starter in the NHL? Because clearly it wasn't that much longer.
No, and what always puzzled me about that trade is the fact that when you're dealing with such young goalies, and all the programs and all the scouts that I've ever heard talk and all the development coaches I've ever heard talk is they say that goalies their development takes longer than, say, like a number one center would, or, a highly skilled winger would. And even I would almost group defensemen in that grouping in with the goalies as well, that it's a tougher position. What I don't understand is why they would jump the gun, not knowing what either of these guys could do in the AHL.
Exactly.
Like why are you trading guys before they'd even come into your system? Like, play them, bring them to the Marlies, play them 1-2, figure out which is the best, and then make a trade from there. Like, and I know the Leafs wanted, they had an aging roster at the time, and I know they wanted to continue to push for the cup, but
look what happened. You literally you burnt out Raycroft. Like, they burnt him out. How is this guy supposed to survive? He played however many games he played. I think it was incredible. It was in the 70s for sure. He was exhausted. He was exhausted playing for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And what good did that bring them? What was their end game there? Hey, we're gonna absolutely tire this guy out, and hopefully that he can not be tired in the playoffs, and we can just get on his back and let him carry us to the Stanley Cup Finals. I just don't understand. He played 72 games. He played 72 games in 2006 and 2007. Are we serious? Are we serious, John Ferguson?
But even like that team, we all knew was aging. Like, I don't know what it is with this market at times, and maybe it was just a management thing. But there's no patience. There's no foresight to almost like, and I this is where I really compliment like a president and GM like Masai Ujiri with the Raptors, is he doesn't play the short game.
Yeah.
He plays both the short game and the long game, and each move impacts both. Like he's playing chess, while Leafs management over the years were always playing checkers.
But they were playing a different game. I don't even know if they were playing checkers, man. I don't even know what they were. I don't even know what they were playing.
I don't. And the thing is, like, at the time, yeah, it may have hurt to trade some of the vets to begin a rebuild, but at some point, a rebuild needed to have happened. Like, it didn't need for Brandon Shanahan to come and tear everything down, fire all the scouts, like right after the Nonis era. Like, I remember at the time when they brought Shanahan over, and this actually speaks to all three of these trades as a blanket opinion and thought. But when Brandon Shanahan came over and we knew a rebuild was coming, we knew he wasn't coming over with without tearing the whole thing down. My first thought was, this is the first rebuild I've ever watched as a Leaf fan.
That's incredible, and they've been so poor for how long?
They've had their blimps.
First time, yeah.
They had their blimps. Like, the Doug Gilmour trade salvaged made the '93 team one that is close to everyone's heart. And then we made those few Stanley Cup runs under in the Sundin era, but there was never each of those trades, and to sustain those eras, they were always short term. The Leafs managed and ran their team in a 82 game cycle.
Right.
They never.
It showed, and look what happened though. It showed.
Yeah.
It showed that they clearly didn't care about what was going to happen seasons down the road. It was, listen, we're in game 1. We're going to focus on game 1 to game 82, and that's fine.
Yeah,
that's fine. It's not that it's necessarily a bad strategy, but you don't have the talent at that certain time. You didn't have the talent to do that. You didn't have Sidney Crosby, where it's like, all right, let's take it year by year because we know we have the best player in the game.
Yeah.
So really, and there's really no one to blame other than within. But why the Leafs? Why did the Leafs get struck with the management like this? Why did it take so long for them to figure out that their strategies were so flawed? That's what I don't understand as a new age Leaf fan. I don't really, can I call myself that after 23 years? But middle of the pack, I guess. Why for 23 years have I been a Leaf fan, and just now, when I turned 18 or 19, just now are they starting to turn a corner? Like, where was this? Why did it take so long? This is what I don't understand after going through all these trades.
No, and neither do I. And that was one of my final thoughts as you and I were going through, and I did some my own little some additional reading as well. Was did they fear that they were going to lose their fans? Like, did they really need to make it seem like every year they were going to win? And I get that's where Leaf fans get the jabs of, let's plan the parade, because literally that's how management played it. Every year was going to be the year. It didn't matter what next year held. It didn't matter, if they had, a prospect pool set up where where the program could sustain itself. Like, they were always, it was one management group after another that looked external for answers. So now when I look at, this current roster and some of the difficulties and challenges, everyone's immediate reaction is the solution is external, because that's what we've been accustomed to.
Right.
Is the Leafs don't trust enough. And I'm actually kind of happy that with this current management group is, they have done a pretty good job with asset management. No one could have predicted, COVID hitting and the cap going flat and having to make some difficult decisions this past off season. But we still have a prospect pool that is pretty sturdy. They're looking outside of the box. They're looking to the KHL, for prospects. They're looking at the college leagues for, players that may have fallen through the draft. They're drafting players maybe a year before they would be eligible. Like, Nick Robertson was probably, drafted a year before, most people even thought that he would, even be drafted. But they're taking these chances and they're building up a pipeline that we've never seen before. And it does provide... Sorry?
No, you go. You finish your thought.
And it does provide flexibility, and it allows you to fill the holes that you need, but not at the expense of making moves like these.
which you kind of said it there too, and it kind of alludes to the whole like I don't even know how to properly word this, because you said, were they worried that they were going to lose fans, that they had to quote unquote contend for the cup every year, and it's so narrow sighted, because it's like, if it hasn't worked previously, didn't work last year, didn't work the year before that, didn't work the year before that, why would it work now? Why would buying people in free agency and making bad trades work now? And I'm not even talking like now as in 2020. I'm talking now as in, 1988, after the first trade, after that first really bad trade. Like, I'm talking in the sense that they just keep repeating their mistakes over and over and over again, thinking that the next trade they make would be the trade that will turn it all around. Like, why would a trade turn it all around? That's what I've never understood.
It's because they didn't have a prospect pool. I think at the end of the day, that's what it was. Is they couldn't trust in their system. And it's funny because, like, when you look at some of the guys that came through the system, kind of like at the tail end of like the 90s and early 2000s, like your Thomas Cabrolets and a few other guys where they drafted late, all of a sudden, this late pick, no one knew who he was. And all of a sudden, he's having an impact. Yeah. The Leafs lucked out in some of these situations. You know what I mean? Like, they didn't develop well. They didn't use the Marlies for what and they didn't use the AHL and the Marlies for what every other team used their minor league system for. They constantly felt like they had to rush players. It kind of just speaks to, like, even just like more modern day, mishaps is like rushing Luke Shen and, making like, this is another trade that, is a little bit lower down on the Leafs' worst trade list, but the Carlo Koliakovo, Alex Steen for Lee Stepniak trade. Like, what were people thinking?
Like for what?
It's just, it's stuff like that. It's that short-sightedness. It's that need to make a change. It's the fear the fans are going to get angry. That's just what it was. It was just a cycle of fear that, the media held a big stick in the city for a long period of time. It took, some, I think having Lou come in and kind of righting the ship, changing the culture.
Right. So what? The talent was always there. Clearly, the talent in these players were there. It was the culture. It was the roles that they were given, and it was the fact that they just didn't have time to develop. They had one bad game. They were on the front page of the Toronto Sun. And it's like, how do you expect these guys to develop? How do you expect these guys to want to succeed, to want to do well when, you're ridiculed for every mistake?
Well, the Leafs are like, like you look back, like they traded Lanny McDonald, they traded Daryl Sittler, they traded, like these are guys that still had, like a lot of fuel left in their tank, like, and then it's funny because then you look at, like, for example, the Wendell Clark for Matt Sundin trade. A lot of the fans and media were like, "Oh my God, what did the Leafs just do?" You know what I mean? Like, as much as we all love Wendell Clark for what he brought, by the time the Wendell Clark Matt Sundin trade happened, Wendell Clark was a shadow of himself.
Sure.
He was starting to get older. At the time, Doug Gilmour and all those guys were getting older. Like, the team was scared that the fans were going to turn on them, so they didn't want to do a rebuild then. But that would have been another opportunity to have righted the ship. And then we went through it with JFJ, and then we did it with Brian Burke and him kind of wanting to do a rebuild on the fly and, like, kind of having, 1 foot in the future, 1 foot in the present. And you can't do it like that.
Which is also another reason why I just never understood. And this is probably to wrap it up. I know we're kind of, beating a dead horse here, but just in the sense of, like, losing fans. Like, these fans went through Harold Ballard, where they would show up to games with literal bags on their head, and they still came to games, and they showed up. They showed up the year after. They showed up the year after that. They showed up the year after that. So it's like, where were they getting this notion that they were, quote unquote, going to lose fans or feel that, well, we need to make a splash here. We need to sign somebody. We need to make a trade, to energize the fan base or to make the fan base happy. Because really, like you said, if they were playing the long game / chess / using common sense, they'd realize, hey, maybe if we created an actual good team that can compete for more than just this year, we'll gain more fans. We'll have fans stick around. We'll give fans a reason to show up to the stadium. It just, I don't know, man. That the management and reading some of these deals really, really, really made me appreciate Kyle Dubas, Shanahan, and what the Leafs management are doing today, because it is night and day.
Yeah, it's completely different. Like, and I know we've spoke about it. You've written blogs about it. I've written blogs about it. That this organization needed a cultural change. And I think by bringing in guys like Brandon Shanahan, Lou Lamoriello, yes, a younger Kyle Dubas at the time, so people with that little bit of a new wave of thinking, it forced the Leafs to see hockey differently. And they're mimicking what championship teams do. They're drafting well. Their asset management is pretty good. With a salary cap, you every year, you have to make some tough decisions. But if you plan in advance and you have a pretty rich pipeline of prospects, you can fill some spots, and the Leafs are well enough in a position to be able to do that. It gave them the flexibility to sign on some veterans this past offseason like Joe Thornton, Wayne Simmons. If you do things right, even in a crunch, you can come out of it. And that's why I was never really worried about this quote unquote cap crunch that supposedly the Leafs were facing, because they never had assets that were dead. Like, they weren't dead on the books. They were movable assets. Teams wanted Kapanen. Teams wanted Johnson. If worst case scenario, if you had to move Marder or Nylander, teams want them. And I don't care what some I don't care what some fans think, and I don't care what some of the in the media say. These players are desirable to certain teams. You can make a move. People, players can be shifted off this team if need be. Absolutely. So it's in that ability to have that flexibility that you're doing something right. And even still, you can make all the right decisions and still not win. It took Washington Capitals 10 years to win. It took Tampa Bay with Steve Stamkos 10 years to win, and he wasn't even playing. Yeah. Right? So, you can still make all the right decisions and never win. So, it just sometimes it's luck. Playoffs, much like in every sport, is you have to face injuries, and if you can get through those and manage those, then it's literally become a war of attrition in the playoffs when you're playing every second night. So I'm more, and this is a funny topic. We wanted to have kind of leave 2020 on a funny note, but it does really speak to a more serious topic of the importance of management, the importance of patience, the importance of realizing that there's a need, but there's a way to acquire it where you're not giving up too much, would be my takeaway from all this.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, no, I agree. I agree fully. I think there's a lot to take away from all this, especially doing a lot of research. I think for myself, truthfully, be patient. Be patient. Let's stop rushing into deals. Let's stop losing deals for the sole purpose of making the fan base happy, because that clearly has never worked. And like I said this a couple minutes ago, I am just happy that Toronto was trending in the right direction for the first time in a long time. And it's a lot nicer to look back at history, even over the last 4 years, and know that some of the deals that have been made have went into Toronto's favor, albeit obviously a few haven't. But for the first time in a while, it seems like Toronto's making the right moves, and they'll be on the other end of, worst team trades in history.
Most definitely. And that's kind of where, we can leave off this latest podcast. For all of our listeners, you can look us up on Facebook at Center of Reduce Nation, or on Twitter, Center of Reduce Nation, and have, leave us your thoughts and opinions. But Lucas, any final thoughts before we wrap this up for, our second last podcast of the year?
No, I could save this for the last podcast of the year, obviously, but it's been a time. It's been a crazy year so far. Can't believe we're already on our second last one of the year. But yeah, I'll save the mushy stuff for the end.
Excellent. So I guess, thank you again for listening. Be sure to head to manscaped.com. Use the promo code CLNation for 20% off. Get all your Christmas gifts in. And also don't forget to check out our blog at centersnation.com. We just uploaded a player profile on the Leafs' new signing, Alexander Barabanov. Check it out. Thanks again.